Hello everyone, and thank you for clicking on this video. Are you having trouble falling asleep? You're in the right place. The Scary Nightmare is here to help you find peace before bed. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any updates that will help you relax. Now, lie down comfortably, take a deep breath, and let go of any tension. The story is about to begin. Story 1. I never believed in the supernatural. Not really. Sure, I'd heard the stories. Ghostly whispers, apparitions in the night, strange noises that could never be explained. But those were always just stories, weren't they? Something to tell around a campfire or to amuse your friends when you were bored. Nothing more. But that all changed one quiet, foggy night when I made a decision that altered everything I thought I knew. It was my first week in this old house. I had found the property on a listing for a ridiculously low price, and when I saw it, I thought I had stumbled upon a treasure. A large, two-story building hidden in a forgotten part of the city, with overgrown hedges and a long driveway that led up to the front door. It was isolated, almost idyllic, a retreat from the world. The structure itself was grand, albeit slightly worn down from years of neglect. But I saw potential. This place had character, I thought. It felt like the kind of home that could be restored to its former glory with some effort. I'm not sure what drove me to purchase the house, but after weeks of thinking, I signed the papers. Maybe I wanted peace, or maybe I was just running from something. Perhaps it was a little of both. The house had no neighbors to speak of, only woods that stretched out behind it. From my bedroom window, I could see the trees swaying in the wind, the faint sounds of distant birds, the occasional rustle of small animals. It was the kind of silence that was both calming and unsettling. There were no voices, no cars, no city noises, just nature and something else. The first few nights were peaceful enough. I went about my business, unpacking boxes and setting up the house. The weather was cool, and a slight breeze made the curtains sway ever so gently. However, as the days wore on, I began to notice odd things. Subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once they added up. The first incident was the door. I'd locked it before going to bed, only to find it wide open the next morning. I figured I'd simply forgotten, but the thought of that didn't sit well with me. I knew I'd locked it, but maybe I was just tired. The second time it happened, I dismissed it even more quickly. But then the third time came. I woke up to find the door open once again, but this time, I was certain I had locked it before going to bed. There was no mistaking it. The latch was in place when I checked, but it was open. I rushed downstairs to the kitchen, and to my horror, I noticed the back door was ajar as well. Something wasn't right. There was a chill that spread across the room, a feeling that I couldn't shake. It was as though someone was watching me, standing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. I told myself it was just the wind. I kept thinking it was the wind. But then the sounds started. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Creaking floors, distant thumps, the faint sounds of something dragging across the floor upstairs. I ignored it, but the noises grew louder. At night, I could hear footsteps pacing the hallway above me, slow and deliberate. It was like someone was walking around, just out of reach. I would get up, check the house, and find nothing. Nothing but the thick, unsettling silence of a house that seemed too quiet. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, reading, I heard the sound of something scratching at the door. It was faint, but I could hear it clear as day. A slow, deliberate scratching, almost like fingernails dragging across the wood. My heart raced as I approached the door, but when I opened it, there was no one there. The world outside was dark and still, with only the distant sounds of the forest to keep me company. I stepped out onto the porch, calling into the night, but there was no reply. Over the next few days, things only escalated. Objects began to disappear. A pen, a book, a set of keys. all vanished without explanation. I'd find them in strange places, in corners of rooms I hadn't been near. The worst part was the whispers. They started softly, just below my hearing, a low murmur that seemed to come from nowhere. I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that I was hearing someone speaking in the room with me. But when I would turn on the lights and scan the room, no one was there. It was after one particularly restless night that I decided to take action. I couldn't live like this. The dread was suffocating. So, I made up my mind to get out of bed and check the entire house thoroughly. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight, I made my way through each room. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I checked the basement, the attic, every closet, and every room. I was alone. But when I reached the hallway outside the attic door, I stopped dead in my tracks. A shadow moved at the top of the stairs, just beyond my sight. I froze, holding my breath, watching as the shape shifted slowly, almost as if it were waiting for me to do something. The air grew heavier, and the whispers began again, louder this time, almost in a chant. It was too much. I dropped the flashlight, and it clattered to the ground, illuminating the dark space in a cone of light. For a moment, everything was still. Then, I saw it. In the light of the flashlight, there was something standing at the top of the stairs. A figure, tall and thin, with elongated limbs. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away, unable to move, unable to breathe. The whispers were deafening now, and the air grew cold. The thing in the doorway stretched its hand toward me, long fingers reaching out, impossibly long, as if they could stretch the very fabric of time and space itself. I turned to run, but when I looked back, the thing was right behind me. It wasn't the figure anymore. It was more like a presence, a weight, something that clung to me, suffocating me. I felt a rush of cold air and heard the sounds of my breath growing shallow as I sprinted toward the door. I reached for the knob, and for a split second, I thought I'd escape. But then, just as I was about to turn it, something grabbed my wrist. I looked down at my hand, and in that moment, I saw the thing's fingers wrapped around my skin, cold and clammy, like death itself. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the silence. I was frozen in place, unable to move. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was the shape of the thing, its face coming closer, its eyes empty, hollow voids that seemed to consume everything they touched. When I woke up, I was back in my bed. It was morning, and the house was silent. The door was locked, and nothing seemed out of place. But I knew better. I could feel it. The presence, lingering in the corners, watching, waiting. The house was no longer empty. I had become part of it now, trapped between this world and the next. And as the days went on, the whispers only grew louder. Story 2. The house had always been old, but in the months I'd spent living there, I began to notice that it was aging in ways that didn't make sense. There were things that had started to wear down much too quickly for the passage of time. The wood on the banister was darkening, the walls were warping, and the floors creaked more than they should have. What unsettled me more was how I felt a constant presence around me, something that lingered in the background of my daily life, always on the periphery of my awareness. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that it was just the house settling, that it was all in my head. But it wasn't. It began with the subtle changes, the things that were difficult to pin down. I'd walk into a room and feel a sharp chill, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in the space of a few moments. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, only to find the covers pulled off me. I'd check the windows, but they were locked, the curtains drawn tightly, and yet the coldness lingered. I would get up, close the window, and crawl back into bed, convincing myself that I had just been imagining things. There were sounds, too. Scraping noises that would echo through the walls late at night, like something being dragged across the floor above me. I'd lie still, listening, trying to dismiss it, but the sound would never stop. It was rhythmic, as though something or someone was pacing the hallway above my bedroom. The first few nights, I chalked it up to the house's old infrastructure, but as the noises continued, I found it harder to ignore. I never considered leaving. There was something about the house, despite its imperfections, that felt familiar in an odd way. It was as though it had been waiting for me. So, I stayed. I told myself that I could deal with the sounds, that I could get used to the cold spots and the odd sensations I felt when I was alone in certain rooms. But one night, as I lay in bed, trying to sleep, I noticed something I couldn't explain. It was the shadow. I had awoken to the sound of a faint scuffling noise coming from the living room, but when I got up to investigate, I found the house in the same quiet stillness as always. No lights were on, and there was nothing that seemed out of place. I stood there for a while, trying to listen for the source of the sound, but all I could hear was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Turning to go back to bed, I caught sight of something in the corner of my eye. A shape, just at the edge of my vision, standing in the living room. It was fleeting, but the figure seemed to be there for just a moment before vanishing. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. I stood there, staring into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all. I convinced myself that I was tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the next night, the same thing happened again. I woke up, my eyes immediately drawn to the living room, where I could have sworn I saw something moving just out of the corner of my eye. This time, it wasn't a fleeting shape, but a darker, more defined shadow, standing in the center of the room. The air grew colder, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I didn't move. I simply watched. The shadow remained still for a moment, almost as if it was aware that I was looking at it. And then, just like before, it disappeared. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, I spent hours lying awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. But when the morning came, I told myself it had all been a dream, a figment of my exhausted imagination. The house was old, and my nerves were frayed. I convinced myself it wasn't real, but deep down, I knew it was. In the following days, I started noticing more things. Small objects that were never in the places where I had left them. A vase that had been sitting on the kitchen counter for weeks would suddenly be moved to the dining table. A book I'd left on the shelf would be found lying on the floor. At first, I thought it was simply my forgetfulness, but as it continued, I began to realize that something or someone was moving things around. One night, after a particularly long day of work, I returned home, exhausted, to find that the entire house felt different. The air was thick, oppressive, like the house itself was breathing. The familiar creaks of the floorboards seemed louder than usual, and the silence that had always been comforting now felt heavy and suffocating. I went through my usual routine. I grabbed a quick bite to eat and went upstairs to bed. But something was wrong. I could feel it. As I entered the hallway, I glanced toward the attic door. It stood ajar, just slightly, as though someone had left it open. I hadn't been to the attic in weeks, and I was sure I had closed it. A shiver ran down my spine. I stood frozen for a moment, debating whether or not to investigate. The logical part of me told me to just go to bed, to ignore it. But curiosity got the better of me. I slowly approached the attic stairs and ascended. The air grew colder as I reached the top. The attic was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. I could feel something, an energy, a presence, gathered in the far corner. My eyes instinctively went to that spot, but there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned around to leave, but as I did, I heard a sound behind me, a soft rustle, like the whisper of fabric. My pulse quickened. Slowly, I turned back to the room, but once again, there was nothing. The attic was empty. I started to back away, my heart pounding, but before I could reach the stairs, I felt something. A sudden, oppressive weight pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and I stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the shadows seemed to shift. They stretched out, curling around me like a living thing, trapping me in place. I could feel something watching me. Something close, just out of reach, its presence pressing in from all sides. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to escape, but the stairs seemed farther away than before. The weight on my chest grew heavier, suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, unable to move. The shadows around me seemed to thicken, taking on a form. It was like a figure was emerging from the dark corner. Slowly, methodically, its shape becoming more distinct with each passing moment. It was at that moment that I realized I wasn't alone in this house. Whatever had been watching me for all this time was no longer content to stay hidden. It was coming for me, and as I finally managed to stumble down the stairs, gasping for air, I realized that there was no escape. The house had chosen me. When I finally made it back to my room, I locked the door, trembling, but I could still feel the weight of the presence lingering, watching from the shadows. I lay there in the dark, trying to convince myself that it was just fear, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. It was real. And the worst part? It was only just beginning. Story 3. There's something unsettling about being alone in a house at night, the quiet stretching out around you, punctuated only by the occasional creak of old wood or the distant hum of an appliance. But the silence in my new home, at first a comforting blanket, began to feel more like a warning. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. For months, I had dismissed the strange feelings, the eerie quiet, the occasional unease when I walked from one room to another, the way the house seemed to change subtly every day. But it was during one particularly cold evening that I finally started to recognize that something was wrong. The night had fallen fast, bringing with it an almost unnatural stillness. The air outside was thick with fog, swirling around the house and making everything seem distant. I sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, a book in my lap, but my attention was elsewhere. My eyes kept drifting to the window, where the streetlights outside cast long, wavering shadows across the yard. It was almost as though the fog was creeping inside, or maybe it was the shadows themselves that were shifting and sliding against the walls, pushing into the house, infiltrating the space. I told myself it was just the weather. It was a regular foggy night. Nothing unusual about it. But when the clock struck midnight, that's when I noticed it, again. A subtle sound, barely perceptible at first, coming from somewhere above me. A soft tapping, like the flick of a fingernail against wood. My eyes snapped up to the ceiling, the noise coming from somewhere near the attic. I hadn't been up there in a while, but I was sure I had locked the door. I tried to ignore it, focusing back on my book, but the tapping continued. It was soft, like a whisper, but it was rhythmic, almost like a person gently knocking on the ceiling, each tap sharp and deliberate. I looked up again. The sound was still there. It was slow, but it was there, and it was getting louder, more insistent. I didn't get up right away. I told myself it was just the house settling, just the wind playing tricks. The tapping grew louder and faster, and soon it was a series of taps, like something was clawing at the wood, scratching and scraping with a purposeful force. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was a sound that didn't belong in a house like this. It felt foreign, out of place, as if the house was trying to communicate something, something that had been dormant, waiting. I stood up, the blanket falling to the floor with a soft thud, and slowly made my way to the staircase. I hadn't checked the attic in weeks, and maybe it was just an animal or some loose pipe. But with every step I took, the tapping seemed to grow louder, more frantic, as though whatever was up there was becoming impatient. Reaching the door at the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The door to the attic was old and heavy, its wood weathered and scarred from years of neglect. It stood slightly ajar, just enough to suggest that it had been opened recently. I could feel a draft seeping through the crack. The house was old, and I had never been particularly keen on the idea of venturing into dark, musty spaces, but tonight something compelled me. I had to know what was making that sound. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The stairs creaked underfoot, groaning like they were protesting my presence. The air in the attic was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood and forgotten things hit me the moment I stepped inside. The floorboards were warped, some of them bowing under the weight of time, others cracked in ways that made walking across them feel like an act of balance. The attic was large, its walls lined with boxes, old furniture, and things I hadn't yet gone through. It felt abandoned, forgotten, a place where things had been left to decay in the dark. As I stepped further in, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a brief moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. But then I saw it. In the far corner, barely visible in the dim light of the bulb overhead, something shifted. A shadow, long and thin, stretching along the wall. It was barely a silhouette, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't seem like a shadow cast by anything in the room. There was nothing near it to cast such a shape. I took a few cautious steps toward it, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow moved again, as though it was aware of my presence, and I froze, the air around me growing thick with a coldness that seeped into my bones. My mind raced. The attic was empty. There was no one else in the house, I was sure of it. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something that shouldn't be. I took another step forward, the floorboard creaking under my weight. That's when I saw it more clearly. A faint outline of something crouched in the corner, its limbs twisted in ways that didn't seem natural. The shadows had taken on a shape, a form that I could no longer deny. The room seemed to grow darker, the light from the bulb flickering as I stood there, rooted to the spot. I should have turned and run. I should have left, locked the door, and never returned. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed by fear, unsure if what I was seeing was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The shadow shifted again, and I heard it then, soft, labored breathing, as if the thing was struggling to move. The air around me felt heavier, the darkness more oppressive, and every instinct screamed at me to get out. But before I could turn away, the figure in the corner moved. Slowly at first, then faster, its limbs stretching unnaturally long as it began to rise from the floor. I wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in my throat, lodged there by the sheer terror of what I was witnessing. The creature, if it could be called that, stepped into the faint light of the bulb. Its face was a blur, shifting in and out of focus, as if it was never meant to be seen. Its skin, if it even had skin, was dark and mottled, like something that had been left to rot in the dark for too long. Its eyes were empty, black holes that seemed to consume everything around them. And then it moved toward me. It wasn't fast, but it didn't need to be. Each step it took brought it closer, and I felt the temperature in the room plummet even further. My body trembled as the thing came closer and closer, its presence filling the space with a suffocating weight. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. The creature reached out, its fingers long and spindly, and I thought, for a moment, that I could see something shifting in the darkness around it. Other shapes, other things, hidden in the shadows, waiting. The creature's hand was just inches from mine when I managed to tear my gaze away. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my legs weak, my body trembling with a terror I had never known. As I ran down the stairs, I could hear it behind me, the sound of its dragging footsteps, slower now, as if it didn't need to rush. I reached the bottom of the stairs and slammed the door to the attic shut, my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps. I leaned against the door, my body shaking uncontrollably, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The house was silent once again, but I knew it was still there, waiting, lingering in the dark corners of the house. I spent the rest of the night in my room, the door locked and the lights on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I knew then that the house had never been truly empty. Whatever had been living in the attic, whatever had been tapping on the ceiling, had been here long before me. It had always been here, and now it was watching, waiting. The next morning, I left the house. I didn't pack, didn't even think to gather my things. I just left. The house behind me loomed in the distance, its windows dark, its doors closed. But I knew better than to believe it was empty. It wasn't. It never would be. And as I walked away, I could feel it in the air. The house was still watching me, still waiting. Story 4. The house had been quiet for months. After my harrowing experience in the attic, I left, vowing never to return. I found a small apartment in the city, far from that place. I tried to forget it, tried to erase the memories of the strange things I had encountered, but they lingered like smoke. Each time I closed my eyes, I would see the shadow, its long limbs stretching unnaturally across the dark corners of the room. It had been 6 months since I left the house behind. I had been living in my new apartment, but the unease still followed me, a quiet whisper that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I had tried to get back to some sense of normality. The nightmares, however, continued, and every so often, the feeling of being watched returned. But this time, it wasn't as intense. It was as if the house had given me a temporary reprieve, allowing me to think that maybe, just maybe, I was safe. But the phone call came on a rainy evening. It was from the real estate agent who had sold me the house. I had never expected to hear from him again. I had assumed the house had been resold, that someone else had moved in and taken my place. But the tone in the agent's voice was different, more urgent than I had ever heard before. He told me that the house had been sold again, but not to a new family or a couple, as I had hoped. The new owner was strange, the agent said. There was a presence about him, something that made the neighbors uneasy. They said he spent most of his time in the attic. At the mention of the attic, I felt a chill spread across my back. I had not been back there after that night, but I remembered clearly the coldness of the room, the presence that lurked just beyond the edge of sight. The agent told me the new owner had inquired about the house's history, asking questions that seemed innocent at first. But as the weeks went by, the agent started noticing strange things happening around the property. The lights in the house would flicker on and off at odd hours. The windows, though they had been freshly cleaned, would become covered with condensation during the night, as though something was breathing on the glass from the inside. The agent had urged me to come back to the house and check on it. He said that it was in my best interest, that I might be able to explain things. But I hesitated. The thought of returning to that place made my stomach churn. I had left it behind for a reason, and now I was being asked to face it again. The darkness of the house, the unsettling noises, the feeling of being watched, it was all coming back. But I knew I couldn't ignore it. Something about the agent's voice told me that this wasn't just about the house anymore. There was something more to it. After a long pause, I agreed. The drive back was uneventful, but as I approached the old neighborhood, I felt the unease settle into my chest again. The house sat at the end of the street, its windows dark and uninviting. The yard, which had once been overgrown and wild, now looked neatly trimmed. The hedges had been cut back, and the once barren driveway now had fresh gravel. But there was something unnatural about the way the house stood there, waiting. I parked the car in front of the house, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. For a moment, I thought about turning around and driving away, never looking back. But something inside me urged me forward. I got out of the car and walked to the front door, feeling the cold air press against my skin. The door creaked open as I pushed it, and I stepped inside. The familiar scent of dust and decay hit me immediately, but there was something else now, something damp, like the air was thick with moisture. The house was still, too still. I stood in the entryway for a moment, taking in the familiar surroundings. The old wooden floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I could hear the faint sound of something, scraping distant, like the sound of claws on wood. I slowly walked through the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. The walls seemed to lean in, the very air felt thick with an oppressive weight. The house was no longer just a house. It had become something else, something that felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. I walked upstairs to the second floor, my heart pounding in my chest. The familiar hallway stretched out before me, and the door to the attic stood at the end. It was ajar. I froze, staring at it. I hadn't meant to go up there. I hadn't planned on stepping into that room again, but my feet moved before I could stop them. I reached the attic door, and as I pushed it open, I felt the temperature drop. The air inside was heavy, stagnant, as though it had been trapped in this room for years. The attic looked the same as it had when I left. The old furniture, the boxes, the forgotten things. But now, there was something more, a presence that seemed to hang in the air, a feeling of something watching from the shadows. The light overhead flickered, casting long, warped shadows across the walls. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but the door remained closed, the darkness on the other side pressing in. I turned back to the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was colder now, the air thick with something I couldn't explain. I walked further in, the floorboards creaking beneath me, and I immediately felt the weight of the room press in on me. There was no longer the comforting silence. Now, there was only a low hum, like a vibration in the walls, as if the house itself were alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't understand. It was then that I saw it. The figure stood in the far corner of the attic, its form barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't make out its features at first, but I could feel its presence, an overwhelming sense of malice and hunger. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs stretched unnaturally long, like they were made of something other than flesh. My heart raced, but I couldn't move. It was as if my body had been frozen in place, my mind unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure remained still, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze burning into me like a physical force. I tried to back away, but the floor beneath me seemed to shift, the shadows moving in ways they shouldn't. The air grew heavier, and I felt as though I were being pulled toward the figure. I stumbled backward, but the thing reached out its hand, or something like a hand, stretching toward me. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs burned as I bolted down the stairs, through the hallway, and out the front door. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the house. But even as I drove, I could feel it. The house. It was still there, watching me, waiting. The figure in the attic, the thing that had once seemed like a shadow, was now more than that. It had followed me. It had always been there, and now it was coming for me. The phone call from the real estate agent had been the beginning, the warning. But now I knew better. The house hadn't been sold to anyone new. The thing that lived there had merely been waiting for the next person to step inside. It was never just a house. It was a trap. And once it had you, there was no escaping. I don't know who the new owner was, but I know one thing for sure. They would never leave. Not as long as the house was standing. And neither would I. Story 5. The sound of silence has always been unsettling. After years of living in cities, surrounded by constant noise, the hum of traffic, the chatter of people, the distant rumble of a train, it was difficult to adjust to the oppressive stillness that surrounded me when I moved to the countryside. The house I rented was old, much older than I expected, but it had a charm to it, something comforting in its rustic simplicity. The floors creaked with every step, the roof groaned when the wind picked up. But despite these quirks, the house was peaceful. Or so I thought. It was just a small cottage, tucked away at the edge of a small town. The previous tenants had moved out months ago, leaving behind their furniture and half-unpacked boxes. It wasn't the most glamorous place, but it had a warmth that I found comforting. The interior was dim, filled with worn furniture, faded paintings on the walls, and small trinkets left behind by people who had once lived there. It was a place that felt like it had a history, one I didn't mind becoming a part of. But something about the house, about the land surrounding it, was different. The further I ventured into the house, the more I began to notice odd things. Small details that, on their own, didn't seem like much, but when taken together, began to create an atmosphere that felt wrong. The first strange occurrence happened a few days after I moved in. I was unpacking in the bedroom when I found an old photograph tucked behind a dresser drawer. The photo was faded, the edges worn, but the faces in it were still clear enough to make out. It was a family, standing together in front of the house, smiling. They looked happy. But what caught my attention was the date written on the back. 1963. I had been told that the house had been rented out only recently, but the photograph suggested otherwise. I tried to dismiss the thought. Old photos were common in old houses. Perhaps the previous tenants had simply left it behind, not thinking much of it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. I placed the photo back in the drawer, trying to forget about it, but the unease lingered. As the days passed, I noticed more things that unsettled me. The air inside the house felt thick, heavy, as though it were full of secrets. The temperature fluctuated, sometimes growing uncomfortably warm, and at other times, so cold that I could see my breath in the air. The windows, despite being tightly closed, would fog up from the inside, the condensation leaving strange patterns that looked like handprints. I would wipe them away, only to find new ones the next morning. The sounds at night were what troubled me most. At first, I thought they were just the noises of an old house settling, creaks in the floorboards, the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. But as time went on, the noises became more pronounced. I could hear footsteps in the hallway at night, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth just outside my door. I would get up, open the door, and find nothing. The hallway would be empty, the house eerily still. I tried to brush it off as the natural creaks of an old house, but there was always that nagging feeling at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. The feeling that I wasn't alone. Then came the dreams. At first, they were faint, fleeting, a blurry image of a figure in the corner of the room or a shadow moving across the hallway. But soon, the dreams grew more vivid, more detailed. In them, I would be walking through the house, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. There would be a presence behind me, always just out of reach, a dark shape that I could never quite make out. And no matter how fast I ran, I could never escape it. One night, I woke up suddenly, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I looked around the room, but everything was still. The only sound was the low creak of the floorboards beneath the weight of my own breath. I lay in the dark for a long time, unable to shake the feeling that something was in the room with me, something that had been watching, waiting for me to fall asleep again. I got up and went to the kitchen, hoping that a glass of water might calm my nerves. But when I stepped into the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door to the basement was open, slightly ajar, the shadows inside darker than the rest of the house. I didn't remember leaving it open. I hadn't even thought about the basement. I had no reason to go down there, but something compelled me. I moved toward the door, my feet heavy with reluctance. The air around me seemed to grow colder as I drew closer, and the shadows in the basement seemed to reach out, drawing me in. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but then I gripped it and pulled the door open. The basement was pitch dark. I could barely make out the stairs leading down, their edges worn smooth from years of use. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stepped inside, the air damp and musty, thick with the scent of earth and decay. I reached for the light switch, but before I could flip it, I felt it. A cold draft against my neck, like a breath, soft and uneven. I froze. There was something down there. I didn't need to see it to know. I backed away from the stairs, my breath shallow, my chest tight with fear. I slammed the door shut behind me and stumbled back into the kitchen, my hands shaking. I sat down at the table, trying to calm my racing heart, but I knew that I couldn't stay in the house much longer. Something was wrong with it, something I couldn't explain. That night, the noises escalated. The footsteps grew louder, more pronounced. They moved through the house with a slow, deliberate pace, as if they were aware of me, aware that I was listening. I could hear them in the hallway, outside my bedroom door, moving from room to room. But when I got up to check, there was never anyone there. It was the third night in a row that the footsteps returned. This time, they were accompanied by a soft scraping noise, like something dragging along the floor. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was causing the sounds. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was dark, the air thick with the same coldness that had crept in the night before. I moved down the hall, my eyes scanning the shadows. The footsteps were louder now, closer. They seemed to be coming from the basement. Without thinking, I moved toward the door to the basement, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I had no plan, no idea what I would find. I simply had to know. I pulled the door open and stepped into the basement, the darkness swallowing me whole. The air was colder than it had been before, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in the time it had taken me to walk down the stairs. The scraping sound was louder now, more distinct. It was coming from the far corner, from behind a stack of old boxes that hadn't been touched in years. I moved toward the corner, my breath coming in short bursts. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate. It was almost as if whatever was making the noise was preparing for something. I reached the corner and stopped, my feet frozen in place as I stared into the darkness. And then I saw it. A shape, barely discernible in the dim light, slowly shifted in the shadows. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been in the basement, or in the house, or anywhere at all. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the house, standing on the front porch, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I looked back at the house, but the lights were off, the windows dark. It seemed normal again, the way it had been when I first moved in, but I knew better. The house was not normal. It never had been. The scraping, the footsteps, the shadow in the basement, they were just the beginning. I didn't know how, but I knew that the house was alive, feeding off the fear of those who entered it. I couldn't stay, but I also knew that, no matter where I went, it would follow. The house had chosen me, and now it would never let me go. Story 6. It was nearly impossible to shake the feeling that I was being followed. The sensation crept in on the edges of my awareness, something I couldn't quite place but couldn't ignore either. After leaving the house behind, I thought I was free. I thought I had escaped whatever it was that had taken root in that place. But no matter where I went, the unease never quite left me. I moved to a new city, far from the cottage in the countryside, and found an apartment in a busy neighborhood. There were people everywhere. Cars, streetlights, the noise of life. I hoped that the hustle and bustle would help distract me, that it would drown out the memories of that dark house with its cold, shifting shadows and strange, scraping sounds. But the more time passed, the more I felt as though I were being pulled back. The nightmares had started again, each one more vivid than the last. The footsteps, the scraping, the heavy, oppressive silence of that attic. I could feel it, even in my waking moments. I could feel something in the back of my mind, like a faint whisper, always present but impossible to grasp. I tried to push it all aside, telling myself I was just imagining things, that I was letting the past haunt me. I told myself that I needed to move on, that I needed to live my life. But then one morning, I received a letter. The letter was plain, the envelope white and unmarked except for my name written in neat, almost mechanical handwriting. I had never seen this handwriting before, nor could I think of anyone who would send me a letter like this. I opened the envelope slowly, the unease growing as I pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. There was nothing written on the front, just an odd drawing, a crude sketch of a house, with sharp, angular lines and a darkened shape in the attic window. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I studied the drawing. The house looked eerily familiar, and the figure in the attic. I couldn't shake the feeling that I knew it. I turned the paper over. On the back, in the same neat handwriting, was a single sentence, "It's not over." I sat frozen for several minutes, staring at the letter in my hands. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. How did someone know about the house? How did they know about my experience? I had never told anyone, not in detail, not the way the house had felt, the presence that had taken over it. But someone knew. Someone out there had been watching. I couldn't ignore it. I had tried to move on, to let go of the past, but it had come back. Somehow, it had followed me here. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't escape the pull of that place. It was as though the house had left an imprint on me, like a mark that couldn't be erased. It wasn't just the nightmares. It was the small things, the way my breath would catch when I entered certain rooms, the way the shadows seemed to linger in the corners of my apartment, the flicker of lights when I was alone, and always that sense of being watched. I stopped sleeping well. Every night, the shadows crept closer, and every day, the unease grew. It was as if the past was reaching out for me, pulling me back toward it. I began to avoid the places I had once found comforting. Parks, cafes, anywhere that felt open. I became reclusive, staying inside my apartment, staring out the window, wondering if it was all in my head, wondering if I was simply losing my mind. But I couldn't ignore the letter. It haunted me, the image of the house, the words on the back. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. I had to see the house again. The drive was long, and the closer I got, the more my chest tightened. I hadn't been back since I left, and as the familiar landscape came into view, the memories flooded back with painful clarity. The crooked trees, the overgrown hedges, the dark silhouette of the house at the end of the lane. The same house that had once felt so heavy, so full of secrets. The same house that had been more than just a home. It had been a presence, something alive in its own way. I parked in front of the house, the gravel driveway just as I remembered it, and for a moment I stood still, taking it all in. The air was thick with silence. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of my heartbeat, loud in my ears. The house looked the same, though there was a faint layer of dust on the windowsills. The front door was slightly ajar, and I could feel a cold breeze seeping out. I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling. It took every ounce of willpower to walk up to the door. I didn't know what I expected to find. I wasn't even sure what I was hoping for, but I couldn't turn back now. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The familiar musty smell of old wood and dust filled my lungs. The house was as silent as ever, the air heavy and thick. My footsteps echoed as I moved through the rooms, my gaze shifting nervously from one corner to the next. The walls seemed to lean in, the shadows pressing against the space, suffocating me. Everything was just as I remembered. The furniture, the pictures on the wall, the old curtains that hung limp by the windows. And then, I heard it. A faint scraping sound. Just like before. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, soft but deliberate, like something dragging across the floor. It was coming from upstairs. The attic. My breath caught in my throat. I knew what I had to do. I had to go up there. I couldn't leave without understanding. I couldn't leave without confronting whatever had been in that room with me. I moved toward the stairs, each step creaking underfoot. The air grew colder as I ascended, the scraping sound growing louder, more insistent. I reached the top of the stairs and stopped in front of the attic door. It was slightly ajar, just as I remembered it, the same dark space beyond. I hesitated, the fear that had haunted me since the day I left building inside me, threatening to swallow me whole. But I had come this far. I couldn't stop now. I pushed the door open. The attic was as dark as I remembered, the air thick with dust. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stepped inside, the scraping sound now deafening. It was coming from the far corner, just as it had the last time I was here. But this time I could see it more clearly. The shadows in the corner shifted, like something was moving within them. The scraping noise was joined by the sound of breathing, slow and uneven, filling the space. I felt a coldness seep into my bones, a chill that made my teeth rattle. I stepped back, my chest tightening. The shape in the corner began to take form. Slowly, methodically, the shadows gathering around it. I could feel it watching me, that same oppressive presence that had filled the house before. It was as if the house itself had come alive, feeding on my fear. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang, trapping me inside. The air grew thicker, suffocating, as the shape in the corner grew closer. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing, the shadows growing darker, until there was nothing left but the suffocating presence of whatever had been waiting in the attic. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, and my voice caught in my chest. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The room fell silent. The scraping, the breathing, the presence, it all vanished. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my ears, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. The door creaked open behind me, and I rushed out of the attic, down the stairs, and out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, the engine roaring to life, the tires screeching as I sped away. I never went back. I couldn't. The house had claimed me once before, and I had escaped, but now I knew the truth. The house wasn't just a building. It was something else, something alive, something that would never let go. No matter how far I ran, it would always be there, waiting. Story 7. The weeks following my last encounter with the house were a blur of restless nights and quiet dread. I had hoped that by leaving, by distancing myself from that place, I could finally put it behind me. But the unease I felt after returning lingered like a fog, suffocating every waking moment, clouding every thought. The dreamless nights I had longed for never came. Instead, they were replaced by dreams of dark hallways, endless staircases, and that oppressive weight that had settled in the attic. I tried to live as normal a life as possible. I went back to work, I met with friends, and I kept myself occupied. But the silence in the apartment was no longer a source of comfort. It felt like the stillness before a storm. It was as though the house was calling to me, reaching into my life, trying to drag me back. The letter I had received, the crude sketch of the house and the ominous words, lingered in my mind, haunting me in the quiet moments. It's not over. It was hard to pinpoint exactly when the first odd occurrence happened. The subtle shift in the air, the sudden drop in temperature, the flickering of lights. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing, just the quirks of an old building. But when I began to hear the same scraping sound I had heard in the attic, that quiet, dragging noise, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I told myself it was just the building settling, the pipes or the floorboards. But when I woke up one night, unable to shake the sensation that I was being watched, I knew that something was wrong. The air felt thicker than it should have, heavier, as if it was pressing in from all sides. I lay still in the dark, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen, waiting for something to appear. The silence stretched out, unbearable, but nothing came. Days turned into weeks, and the feeling of unease never left. I had stopped sleeping well. The nightmares had returned, but now they were different. They weren't just fleeting images or shadows at the edge of my vision. They were real, vivid, as if I were still in that house, still trapped inside those walls. Every night, the same hallway, the same attic, the same figure in the corner. Each time I ran, but I never escaped. It always followed me, just behind, just out of sight. I avoided going near the windows, too. The feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. Every time I glanced outside, I would catch a glimpse of something in the reflection, just a flicker of movement behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Nothing except the quiet streets and the dim streetlights. But one evening, as I sat alone in the apartment, the noise came again. It wasn't loud at first. Just a faint scraping, like something being dragged slowly across the floor. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I looked up from the book I was reading, straining to hear, my pulse quickening as the sound continued. It was so familiar, too familiar. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just the pipes or the wind. But the sound persisted, a slow, deliberate scrape that seemed to come from the corner of the room. My body stiffened. I turned, slowly, toward the source of the noise. The corner of the room was empty, but something was there, in the darkness, waiting. The scraping grew louder. It moved, as if someone, or something, was walking across the floor, dragging something heavy behind it. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my breath shallow. The sound echoed in my ears, growing more frantic, like it was getting closer. I moved toward the door, my eyes fixed on the corner, waiting for something to appear. The door handle was cold under my hand, and I pulled it open, stepping into the hallway. The scraping stopped. I stood there, frozen, listening for any sound. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening. I turned to look back at the apartment, my heart racing. But nothing had changed. The room was empty, the shadows dancing on the walls, nothing out of the ordinary. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I was overreacting, I told myself. It was just the building settling. But then, I saw it. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, I saw the faintest movement. It was a figure, tall and dark, standing in the doorway to the apartment. It didn't move, just stood there, staring. I spun around, but when I turned, there was nothing. The hallway was empty. My chest tightened. I was shaking now, the fear clawing at my insides, the feeling of being watched overwhelming. I had to leave. I had to get out. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and ran down the stairs, out into the street. The cool night air hit my face, but it did little to calm my racing heart. I had to keep moving, had to get away from that apartment, from the shadows that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I didn't stop until I was standing at the edge of the city, the bright lights flickering in the distance. I didn't know where to go, what to do, but I couldn't go back. Not to the apartment, not to the house. I couldn't go back to any of it. I found a small park nearby, a place to sit and catch my breath. The benches were empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I leaned back against the wood, trying to calm my mind, trying to make sense of the strange events that had been happening. I closed my eyes for a moment, just to rest, but as soon as I did, the memories came rushing back. The house, the attic, the scraping noise, the figure. It was all the same. I was trapped in a cycle, reliving the same nightmare over and over again. No matter where I went, it followed me. The house had never truly left. It had never stopped. I stood up, my body numb, and walked away from the park, back toward the city. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to go back. I had to confront it. I had to face whatever it was that had been following me. It was late when I arrived at the outskirts of the city. The streets were quieter now, the houses dimly lit by streetlights. The night was cold, but there was a warmth in the air that didn't belong. The feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance, a presence that seemed to hover just behind me, always there, always waiting. I stopped in front of the house. The one that had started it all. The one I thought I had left behind. It stood silent, dark, and empty. The windows were covered in a thick layer of dust, the door slightly ajar, as though inviting me in. I stood there for a long time, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my chest tight with fear. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to face it again, but I knew I had no choice. It had never let me go. I pushed open the door, stepping inside once more. The air was thick with the smell of decay, but it was familiar now. It didn't feel like a house anymore. It felt like a place that had been abandoned long ago, forgotten by time. The silence was suffocating. I walked through the rooms, my steps echoing through the house. The same furniture, the same dust, the same feeling of emptiness. It was as if nothing had changed, as if I had never left. I reached the stairs, the dark, narrow staircase that led up to the attic. The scraping sound began again, slowly, methodically, like something was dragging itself across the floor. I couldn't stop myself. I had to go up there. I had to face whatever was in that room. I climbed the stairs, my legs heavy with dread, and stood in front of the attic door. It was open, just a crack, but enough to see the darkness beyond. The scraping grew louder. I stepped inside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. The shadows seemed to stretch out toward me, waiting. I took one step, then another, the sound of my breath the only thing I could hear. And then I saw it. A shape in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, thin, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. I took a step back, but there was nowhere to go. Story 8. The silence inside the attic was suffocating. The longer I stood there, staring at the figure in the corner, the heavier the air became, pressing down on me as if the house itself was aware of my presence. It was an oppressive feeling, one that I had known before, the suffocating weight that had filled this very room, that had made the walls seem to close in, trapping me. My heart raced, and my hands trembled, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shape. It was barely distinguishable from the shadows, but I knew it was there. I had been here before. I had seen it before. The long limbs, the way it seemed to stretch and writhe in the darkness. But it wasn't just the figure that made my stomach churn, it was the coldness that had returned with it. The air, once again, seemed impossibly cold, and I could feel the chill creep into my bones. The smell of dust and decay lingered, but beneath that was something else. Something that smelled wrong, like something that had been buried for far too long. I had made a mistake. I should never have come back. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to run out of the house, to leave this place behind once and for all. But my feet felt frozen to the floor, as though something was holding me here, forcing me to confront the thing that had haunted me since the first time I stepped foot in this house. I knew I shouldn't stay. The memory of my previous escape, the frantic flight through the house, the door slamming shut behind me, was still fresh in my mind. I had run then, and part of me still wanted to run now. But something was different this time. The dread that clawed at my chest was no longer just fear, it was something else. It was a pull, a quiet compulsion, like the house was calling me, drawing me closer. I had to know what it was, what had been hidden here all along. I took a shaky breath and took one small step forward. The scrape of my shoe against the wooden floor was amplified in the silence. I could feel the weight of the air, thicker than it should have been, suffocating me with every breath. The figure remained motionless in the corner, as though it was waiting for me. I reached out, my fingers brushing the rough wooden beam that ran along the ceiling. The temperature around me dropped again, the cold pressing in from all sides, numbing my fingers. I stepped closer. The scraping sound, faint at first, began again. It wasn't as loud as before, but it was there. It was slow, rhythmic, deliberate, like something was slowly, methodically dragging itself across the floor. I tried to steady my breath, to ignore the panic creeping up my spine, but my body felt heavy, as if every movement took more effort than it should have. The figure in the corner shifted. I froze. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but it moved. The shadow twisted and stretched, limbs elongating unnaturally, fingers splaying out like the roots of an ancient tree, reaching for something. Or someone. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear myself away from this nightmare, but my body refused to respond. The figure's shape grew clearer, more defined, as it slid out of the corner. Its face was still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its presence. I could feel it watching me. It was aware of me. It was waiting. The temperature in the attic plunged further, and the shadows around the figure seemed to deepen, twisting in unnatural ways. The room was no longer just dark. It was thick with something malevolent, something that had been here far longer than I had. The scraping sound continued, now joined by a faint, almost imperceptible rustling noise, as if something was moving in the walls, just behind the plaster. The house was alive, shifting, groaning, its foundations settling, as if it too was aware of my presence. I finally managed to move, taking a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I was terrified, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to get away. But as I turned, I felt it. A cold draft swept through the room, biting at my skin, and the door behind me slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The light bulb flickered overhead, casting long, jerky shadows across the floor. I scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle rattled in my hand, but the door remained locked, stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. My panic surged, and I pulled harder, throwing my weight against it, but it was useless. The door wouldn't open. The figure in the corner moved again, and this time I could hear it more clearly. It wasn't scraping anymore. It was dragging something, its limbs, its hands, across the floor, leaving a faint, wet sound behind. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to face it. The shadows around the figure were no longer just shadows. They were dark, shifting tendrils that seemed to reach out toward me. The air was so thick now that it felt as if the room itself was pressing in, smothering me. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone. I had to call for help. I had to get out of here, but the screen remained black. The battery had died, just like it had the last time I tried to escape. I had no connection to the outside world, no way to reach anyone. I was alone. The scraping sound grew louder, faster. It was coming closer. I turned, looking around the room for anything that might help me, anything that could get me out. But there was nothing. The attic was empty except for the pile of discarded furniture and forgotten items, a heap of old boxes and sheets. The figure moved faster now, its limbs stretched impossibly long, and I could see them dragging along the floor, fingers scraping the boards like claws, like something that wasn't human. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed with fear. The thing in the corner was no longer in the corner. It was moving toward me, and with every step it took, the shadows around it grew thicker, darker, wrapping around me, suffocating the light. The air felt thick with the smell of decay, of something long dead, buried deep within the house. It was everywhere, closing in. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the room shifted. The walls seemed to bend, the floor beneath me seemed to warp, and I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance. The figure was there, right in front of me now, its face still hidden in shadow, its body stretching and twisting like a nightmare made flesh. I could feel its breath, cold and shallow, against my skin. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. I couldn't make a sound. The figure raised one long arm, its fingers curling toward me, and I stepped back, instinctively, but my feet caught on something, one of the old boxes. I fell hard, landing with a thud on the wooden floor, the impact jarring through my spine. The figure stood above me, looming, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It was reaching for me now, its fingers just inches away from my face. But then it stopped. The room fell into an eerie stillness. The scraping ceased. The shadows, though still thick, seemed to pull back, retreating into the corners of the room. I could feel the temperature in the room slowly rise, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I didn't know how long I lay there on the floor, frozen in place, staring up at the figure. The air was heavy, suffocating, and for the first time, I thought that maybe it had been waiting for me to surrender. I didn't know how I managed to stand, but I did. I slowly pulled myself to my feet, my legs shaking, my body weak. The door behind me was still shut, but somehow, I felt like it was the only way out. The figure hadn't moved. It was just standing there, watching me, waiting. I couldn't waste any more time. I had to get out. I ran toward the door, throwing myself at it with all the strength I had left. This time, it gave. The door creaked open, and I rushed through, stumbling down the stairs and into the hallway. But the house had changed. The hallways that had once been familiar were now warped, twisting. Every turn seemed to lead me further into the dark heart of the house, until I realized that I wasn't sure which direction I was headed. The house was alive, shifting around me, drawing me back in, trapping me. I ran faster, the walls pressing in on me, the darkness thickening, but I couldn't outrun it. It was everywhere. The house had claimed me, and there was nowhere left to hide. I could feel it. The thing. The figure. It was there, just behind me, always just out of sight. And no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to go, it would always be with me. Forever. Story 9. The pounding in my chest was deafening. My body was a hollow shell of panic and exhaustion as I sprinted through the house, my feet barely touching the ground, the floorboards creaking beneath me as though the house itself was alive, groaning in protest. Every hallway I passed seemed the same, endless, stretching on until it felt as if I had been running in circles. The weight of the air pressed down on me, thick with a lingering cold, the oppressive shadows creeping at the edges of my vision, threatening to swallow me whole. I could feel them, those long fingers, stretching out from the walls, from the corners, reaching for me. The house was alive. I could no longer deny it. It had never been a home. Not really. It had been a trap, a snare, waiting for the right person to wander in. And now that I had stepped into its grasp, it was refusing to let me go. The once familiar rooms had begun to twist, reshaping themselves, bending and warping as if mocking me, pushing me further into the depths of its suffocating maze. The windows, which once let in the faint light of the outside world, were now covered in grime. The glass darkened, as if the house itself had closed its eyes, turning its back on everything beyond its walls. No light, no sound from the outside. Just the oppressive quiet of a place that had long since forgotten what it meant to be alive. The doors I passed were sealed shut, the handles cold under my hands as I tried to open them, futilely, in my desperate rush. The walls seemed to move, expanding and contracting as I ran, swallowing the rooms I had passed through just moments before. The floor creaked and groaned beneath my feet, shifting as if it had a mind of its own, steering me deeper into the house, guiding me towards something I couldn't escape. I reached the staircase again, the one that had led to the attic. It loomed ahead of me, its narrow steps stretching upward, the cold air from below wrapping around my legs, pulling me back. The house wasn't finished with me yet. It never had been. I tried to turn back, to find another way out, but the hallway behind me had disappeared. There was no turning back now. The only path left was up, toward the attic, where it all began, where the thing, the figure, waited. The house was closing in on me. Every step up the staircase felt heavier, like the house was pulling me toward its heart. The air grew colder with every upward step, the walls seeming to close in tighter, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I was suffocating, trapped in a place that had no mercy. At the top of the stairs, I stopped. The attic door stood before me, the same as it had always been. It looked the same, but it wasn't. I could feel it. Something was different this time. The shadows inside seemed darker, deeper, as if they were reaching out from the cracks in the door, stretching toward me, waiting for me to step inside. I stood frozen, my legs trembling beneath me, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The silence was deafening, the weight of it pressing in on me from every side. I could feel the presence there, beyond the door, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to enter. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to face it again. But I knew I had no choice. The house was waiting for me, and if I didn't face whatever was in that room, it would never stop. I pushed the door open. The coldness hit me immediately. The air was thick with dust and mildew, the smell of decay and rot clinging to everything in the room. The light overhead flickered, casting long, jerky shadows across the walls, and the room felt smaller somehow, as if the very space itself was pressing in on me. The figure was there. I had known it would be. It stood in the corner, tall and thin, its limbs twisted and unnatural. Its face was obscured, just as it had been before, a dark, shifting mass that seemed to move even in the stillness. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a thing I could understand, but I could feel it. I could feel its presence, its hunger. The figure didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, watching, its gaze like ice against my skin. The shadows around it seemed to stretch, extending into the corners of the room, reaching for me, closing in. The temperature in the attic dropped, the cold seeping into my bones, wrapping around my chest, making it harder to breathe. The walls seemed to shift, the space growing smaller, tighter, like the house was constricting around me. I could feel it now, the weight of the house pushing down, closing in, forcing me into this moment, this place. I stepped forward. Each step felt like it took everything I had left. The floor creaked underfoot, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. But still, the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its form barely visible in the dark. I was close now, too close. The shadows shifted again, and for the first time, I felt the air change. The temperature dropped even further, the cold so intense that it hurt to breathe. I could see my breath, thin plumes of fog in the air. The shadows reached for me, moving like tendrils, slow and deliberate. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I extended them toward the figure. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around, but my body wasn't listening. I had come this far. I had no choice but to move forward. The figure's face twisted then. It shifted, reshaping itself, and for the first time, I saw it. Its eyes, black and endless, staring at me from the depths of its face. No, not eyes. Pits. Black, hollow pits that seemed to draw everything into them. I felt my body freeze, my limbs turning to stone as I stared into those pits. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. The shadows around me pressed closer, curling around my feet, wrapping themselves around my legs. I tried to move, to step back, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure was coming closer, moving toward me with slow, deliberate steps, its limbs twisting with each movement. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But I felt it. I felt its coldness, its weight, its presence suffocating everything around me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The air was thick, and my throat was tight. My chest felt like it was being crushed under a weight I couldn't bear. I was drowning, suffocating, trapped in this moment, in this place. The thing was almost upon me now. I could feel it reaching out, its long fingers grazing my arm, cold and clammy. The sensation burned into my skin, a chill that spread through my veins. I tried to pull away, but the shadows held me fast, keeping me in place. I was paralyzed, frozen, and the figure was so close now. Its fingers brushed my face, and I could feel the coldness of its touch, the ice-cold grip that seemed to draw the life out of me with every passing second. But then, just as I thought I would be consumed by it, I felt something shift. Something inside me stirred, a flicker of awareness, a recognition that this wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. The house had never let me go. With every ounce of strength I had left, I jerked backward. The shadows seemed to snap, releasing their grip on me, and I stumbled away from the figure. I couldn't think. I couldn't move fast enough. The air grew thick again, the temperature plunging further. I heard the figure shift behind me, felt it moving toward me, but I didn't look back. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to get out. My body moved on instinct, my legs pumping beneath me, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the scraping sound again, the slow drag of something heavy across the floor, echoing behind me. But I didn't stop. I tore down the hallway, through the rooms that seemed to shift and warp around me, my hands pressing against the walls for guidance, feeling the house twist and turn, dragging me back, pulling me toward it. I could hear the footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, getting closer. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The front door was in sight. I reached for it, my fingers grasping the cold handle, and with one last desperate effort, I threw it open. I burst into the night air, the cool breeze hitting my face, the silence of the outside world a stark contrast to the suffocating weight of the house behind me. But even as I ran, I knew it wasn't over. The house had let me go, but only for a moment. It was still there, always waiting, always watching, and I knew, deep down, that I would never escape. Not completely. Story 10. The air was different outside. It felt fresher, cleaner. The night sky stretched out above me, untouched by the suffocating darkness that clung to the house behind me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe without the weight of the shadows pressing down on me. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so, but I could hear the soft rustle of the wind, the distant sound of an owl in the trees. The world outside felt real, tangible, as if I had escaped the grip of that house. But the relief was short-lived. The road before me stretched out in an endless line, the gravel crunching beneath my feet as I walked away from the house. I tried not to look back, knowing that the longer I stayed in the vicinity, the more the house would pull me back in. But even as I forced my eyes forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking in the background, waiting for me to falter. The house wasn't done with me. It never would be. It had marked me, and no matter how far I ran, it would find a way to reach me again. My thoughts were muddled, the terror from my time inside the house still fresh in my mind. The figure in the attic, the suffocating darkness, the dragging sounds that filled the space. The feeling of being trapped, unable to escape, even when every part of my body screamed at me to leave. I had thought I was free when I ran out of the door. I had thought that the fresh air would wash away the fear, but instead, it only seemed to highlight how much I still carried with me. The weight of that house, the coldness that I had felt in my chest when I was in its grasp, was still there, a constant undercurrent of dread. I walked for hours, though I didn't know where I was going. The road twisted and turned, leading me through woods, past fields, and towards the edge of a town I didn't recognize. I didn't care. I was too numb to care about anything beyond putting distance between myself and the house. The night wore on, and with it came an unrelenting sense of exhaustion. My legs ached, my eyes burned, and yet I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop moving. Eventually, I came upon a small, run-down motel at the edge of town. The neon lights flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. I barely registered the sensation of entering the building, my body moving on autopilot as I checked into a room, the clerk barely glancing at me as I handed over cash. I didn't care about the room, about anything really. I just needed somewhere to sleep, somewhere to escape my thoughts. I collapsed onto the bed, the rough sheets scratchy against my skin. The room was empty, the air stale and musty, but I didn't care. I stared at the ceiling, trying to force my mind to quiet, trying to banish the thoughts of the house. But every time I closed my eyes, it came rushing back. Dark corners, long limbs stretching across the floor, the cold, suffocating presence of something watching me from the shadows. The night stretched on without mercy. I must have drifted off at some point, But when I woke, it was to the sound of scratching at the door. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the remnants of a dream still lingering in my mind, but the sound came again, slow and deliberate, like something was trying to get in. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding, my chest tight with panic. The silence that followed was oppressive, thick with the weight of what had just happened. The scratching stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side of that door. Waiting. Watching. I forced myself to stand, my legs weak and unsteady. My thoughts were a blur of confusion and fear, the kind of fear that grips you when you know something is wrong but can't quite understand what. I walked slowly to the door, my hand hovering over the handle as I stood there, unsure whether I wanted to open it or run. I felt the cold against my skin as I reached for the handle, as though the air in the room had dropped several degrees in an instant. I opened the door. The hallway outside was empty. No one was there. No one, but the feeling remained, thick and oppressive, like a presence just out of sight. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I could hear the distant hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway, flickering occasionally, adding to the tension. I stared down the hallway, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next, searching for something, anything, that might explain the sensation of dread crawling up my spine. There was nothing. I closed the door behind me, my fingers trembling as I locked it. The scratch marks, if they had even been real, were gone. There was no sign of anyone having been there, no indication that something had been in the room with me. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't see but could feel, deep in my gut. I sat back down on the bed, my heart still racing, my mind caught in a loop of anxiety and confusion. I tried to sleep again, to force my mind to quiet, to rest, but every time I closed my eyes, the image of the house filled my thoughts. The dragging sounds, the coldness, the feeling of being watched. The endless hallway that seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness that threatened to consume me. It wasn't over. The thought struck me like a physical blow, a realization that cut through the fog of my thoughts. I had been running as fast as I could, but the house wasn't done with me. It was still there, waiting. I hadn't escaped. Not really. I tried to rationalize it. I tried to tell myself that I was just exhausted, that the fear from the house was still too fresh, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the truth was clear. I couldn't escape the house. I could leave its walls, but its grip was still on me. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts, ready to pull me back in. I had no choice. I had to go back. The thought filled me with dread, but it was the only thing that made sense. I couldn't keep running. The house had claimed me, and if I didn't face whatever it was that had been haunting me, it would follow me wherever I went. I knew that now. The room around me was empty, silent, but the stillness seemed wrong, oppressive. I grabbed my jacket, my hands shaking as I pulled it on. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay anywhere. The house would always be there. I left the motel in the dead of night, the parking lot dark and silent. The world seemed empty, as if it too was holding its breath. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to return to the place that had taken everything from me. The drive felt endless, like I was being pulled back, not by my own will, but by something stronger. I couldn't escape the feeling that the house was waiting, that it had always been waiting for me to come back. And I knew, deep down, that when I got there, the darkness would still be there, waiting for me to step inside. The house never really lets you go. Not once it's claimed you.